Okay, good afternoon, everyone. As many of you know, my name is Prue Klein, and I'm the Marketing Coordinator here at Wine Communicators of Australia. Today's presentation will be presented by Rachel Triggs, Head of ESG and Market Access at Wine Australia. During today's presentation, Rachel will explain how the global operating environment is impacting expectations relating to environmental, social, and governance management by Australian grape and wine businesses, and how Wine Australia is responding to supporting the sector. We've allowed plenty of time for the questions you may have to be answered at the end of the webinar. However, feel free to send them through to us as they come to mind. You can do that via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the webinar. As per usual, this webinar will be recorded, and everyone who's registered will receive a copy of that recording tomorrow afternoon. It is now my pleasure to hand over to you, Rachel, for today's presentation. Thanks so much.
Many thanks, Prue, and to Wine Communicators Australia for the kind invitation to come and present on this very important topic. I'll just start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, which for me is the Narungara people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This is an area that has emerged really out of a market access risk or perspective. So I've spent a lot of time at Wine Australia in the market access space. And when I talk about market access, what I'm not talking about is market entry, marketing, and sort of entry into new markets, but more looking at market access risks that might stymie our efforts to sell wine in the 118 different markets to which we're currently selling Australian wine. And typically these have been things like harmonisation of enological practices, of additives and processing aids, of labelling requirements, of certification requirements, trying to avoid onerous testing upon import into market, those sort of things. And they're all really complicated. They might sound relatively simple when you sort of say them quickly, but they're incredibly complex. And what I've seen in the last 2 years is that the market access space has really changed quite significantly. And it's changed in such a way that the market access risks that are coming down the pipeline are not so much these market access risks that are being controlled by the laws of importing countries, but they're being controlled by the supplier standards that are being applied by individual retailers. So hard enough that we're navigating this complex environment of selling into 118 different markets, including Australia, but even more complex when you look at individual retailers. So for example, in the UK, where the off-trade is dominated by 10 really big retailers, and each of them are all demanding different things from wine companies around environmental, social and governance. Now, I want to acknowledge that the wine industry, Australian wine industry, has got its challenges at the moment. And I would forgive anybody for saying, well, why on earth should this be at the top of my list when I've got all these other challenges that are staring me in the face? And my response to that is that the fact that we have this adversity, we are facing such adversity at the moment, is really no excuse to not understand the drivers and the next challenges that are coming down the pipeline in this space. So I'm going to step you through now some of the drivers around environmental social governance, what best practice looks like, how it is impacting upon the legal and the regulatory environment across the globe, and what that means for Australian grape and wine growers going forward when they're looking at selling their wine into these markets, whether it is overseas markets or whether they're just looking at the domestic market. And then I'm going to switch to explain some of the things that Wine Australia is planning to do to mitigate some of these risks and to help the Australian grape and wine sector. Okay, so first and foremost, what really is ESG? So it's a new way of assessing the risks and opportunities of a business. So it's not a new thing. The idea of corporate entities, corporate responsibility has been around ever since the idea of a company was evolved out of the UK, but this area has changed really quickly over the last few years. So more and more when investors are looking at investing in a company, they're looking at your ESG risk and opportunity. And this is originally really driven by very socially conscious investors who wanted to make sure that the companies that they were investing in had a similar sort of social conscious as they did. So they're now looking at things like environmental impact, the impact on communities, and your performance as an employer when they're actually making these decisions. So this really profound impact that the current environment is having on the way that investors make decisions, the way that banks make decisions about who to loan to, the way that insurers assess your risk and then apply insurance premiums. And all of those things are impacting, in particular, on the way in which retailers are buying our wine globally. And it's particularly prominent in markets like Sweden, across Canada, where you have liquor boards or monopolies that are in step with the government and the legislation being imposed by the government. There's a couple of really interesting things happening across the globe in this space. There's a free trade agreement that's being negotiated between Australia and the EU at the moment. We will 100%, assuming that agreement is concluded, we will see a sustainability chapter worked into that free trade agreement, and it will put treaty level obligations on Australia to engage with the EU on matters relating to sustainability and to make sure that they have a plan that meets a lot of its other treaty obligations as well. We've also got bits and pieces of legislation popping up across the globe. For example, on the 1st of January this year, the German Supply Due Diligence Act was implemented. So a company in Germany that has over 4,000 employees as of the 1st of January this year has mandatory obligations under German law to report down the supply chain. So to be able to do that, they're having to extract all sorts of information about suppliers. So the likes of Lidl or Audi now have a legislative obligation to actually look down the supply chain and make sure that best practice ESG is being implemented across those supply chains. Another really nuanced one is the review of the EU packaging directive. This will apply when it comes into force to all packaging materials sold in the European Union. And that will place minimum obligations as far as recyclability, reuse, and also void space on packaging sold in the EU. One of the most terrifying things, if not infuriating things that the EU has done since 2009, when it magicked the grape variety Prosecco into an appellation or a geographical indication, is that they're proposing in this EU packaging directive that if you're making wine out of an appellation or a PDO, PGI in the European Union that mandates a certain type of bottle, then you will be exempt from those rules. So that's a really, really interesting nuance. So why is it so important? What does ESG look like when it's really well done? If you implement best practice ESG across your business, you're agile, so you're able to respond to changing regulatory environments. You've got a better chance of maintaining your social license to operate, so mitigating risks in that space. It increases the strength of workforce. It increases your ability to withstand climate change. It increases your capability to report in accordance with what your customer is actually demanding of you. And I specifically say customer as opposed to consumer, so that the entity that's actually buying your wine, whether it's a retailer or a distributor, it encourages good decision making, and last but not least, it is having a severe impact on access to capital and ability to actually attract investment. So all in all, you're looking at trade and market access risks, responding to supplier standards, being able to meet reporting requirements, maintaining that social license to operate, and access to capital. So all in all, it really is what I would describe as a necessary burden. A little bit of half glass empty here around the consumer sentiment towards sustainable wine. There is no data out there to support the fact that a consumer is more likely to buy a sustainable wine over a non-sustainable wine. And similarly, there is no hard evidence that they're willing to pay more at this juncture. Now, that is not necessarily to say that that won't come in the future, and it needs to be part of our brand strategy going forward. But the reality is that this area is not being led by the consumer at this juncture. It is being led by the customer, and that is the customer in the retailer, the distributor who is buying Australian wine, who is being so profoundly impacted by the global landscape in this area, the way that investors are operating, the way that the banks are operating, the way that insurance companies are operating. They are the real global drivers behind this. Around this time last year, we embarked on a piece of work to really deeply understand some of the buying requirements or the supply requirements, supply standards of three big retailers across Europe. So we looked at Sainsbury's in the UK, Systembolaget in Sweden, and Albert Heijn in the Netherlands to really run the ruler over what is the whole sort of gamut of what they are expecting from grape and wine businesses or from importers. They're not requesting necessarily the same information from every single company who is supplying into them. So it's very much a risk-based approach where they're looking at what your risk profile is in determining what sort of information you need to be able to provide to them. This is a really good indication of the breadth of what is being asked. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you see there's some pretty strong themes emerging across the E, the S, and the G. We've had a really strong focus here in Australia on the environmental element for a really long time, and probably haven't so much worried all that much around the social part, because we're very lucky in this country in that we have really great laws that promote best practice in a lot of our social arrangements. So we have a Fair Work Act, we have minimum wages, we have anti-discrimination laws, we have rights to freedom of association, all these things that we take for granted that other wine producing countries don't necessarily have. So that is a really good summary of the types of things that we're being asked for. So what Wine Australia has done from here is we've developed an ESG investment plan for Wine Australia. So I just want to be really clear about what this investment plan is and what exactly it isn't. So the first is that it's not a set and forget. So this is intended to be an iterative investment plan that will move with the times, and it is not a plan for the sector, it is a plan to guide Wine Australia's investment. So informed by stakeholders, informed by the sector, it is a plan that will guide our future investments in ESG, albeit in an iterative way, with the intention that anybody else can pick it up and also use it as a cornerstone to development of their individual annual operational plans or strategic plans. It's not a fait accompli. So if you look at I'm going to step you through the themes of the investment plan this afternoon. It's also readily available on our website. We will not be able to do everything in that plan. So it's not a fait accompli. The intention is that individual projects will be seeded from this investment plan, all of which will go through the usual checks and balances that they would usually through Wine Australia. The last 2 points, to be really honest, it's not a schedule of work that Wine Australia can fund alone. So a lot of the projects that will be seeded out of this investment plan will need some significant co-investment. And similarly, it's not a schedule of work that Wine Australia can execute alone. Most of the projects will need to evolve, and they will need really strong co-delivery models. I want to acknowledge the excellent work that's been done across AWRI, Australian Grape and Wine, and Wine Australia to stand up Sustainable Wine Growing Australia over the last 3 years. It is a fabulous program that has gained huge momentum across the industry, and it's put us in really good stead from a brand perspective, at a grassroots level in grape growing and winemaking, but also it's put us really ahead of the curve in that market access space. I will note that at the moment, Sustainable Wine Growing Australia is very heavily focused on the environment, and that's 100% warranted at this juncture. But if we look at some of the metrics that are being captured across vineyards and across wineries, which are all excellent, and then we flick back to what we're looking at coming down the pipeline from the retailers, some of these things that are being worked into supplier standards, you very quickly see that this area is moving at pace, and we need to make sure that we've got checks and balances within our sector through which we can make sure that we're able to demonstrate best practice across that E, the S, and the G. And it's not just the really big retailers globally that are demanding some of these things. So by way of example, I saw supplier standards out of the Melbourne Convention Centre recently. Even the likes of the Melbourne Convention Centre are asking for information around your social governance, the way you treat employees, etc., as a precursor to actually allowing you to sell your wine into that convention centre. So it is an area that's really moving at pace. So I'm going to dive into the nitty-gritty now and walk you through what is in Wine Australia's ESG investment plan. There are 5 pillars. And if you're anything like me, when you're looking, when you're attending one of these webinars or one of these presentations, it's always nice to know how many slides are left and what's coming down the pipeline. So spoiler alert here, there's 5 investment areas. There is 1 slide for each of them that I'm going to talk through. And then there's a thank you slide at the end. So this slide plus 5 slides covering each of the investment areas and a thank you slide. These are rated from 1 to 5 as far as what our stakeholders rated as being the most important being investment area 1 on the left there, practical ESG support. It should be of no surprise that certification and market access are intrinsically linked, because there is a really strong need for certification to mimic what is being demanded at a retail level across the globe. Sustainable packaging is an area that's been given its own investment area. It came through very strongly. Innovation for ESG outcomes is fundamentally running the ruler over our existing research and innovation portfolio. And then marketing and market insights are really, really important enabler and investment area in itself in this ESG investment plan. So the first of 6 slides remaining, including the thank you slide. Investment area 1 is practical ESG support for Australian grape and wine businesses. So ensuring that we have regional support and we're empowering the regions to be able to employ best practice ESG amongst their members and comply with baseline sector standards. The second is a stock take and review of existing tools. So making sure that the tools that we already have available are readily available in one space. And that spans across tools, including tools such as the carbon emissions reduction roadmap, which was launched several weeks ago. A really excellent start in helping Australian grape and wine businesses to map out how they are going to commit to reducing their carbon emissions, and some targets set as part of that as well, which is super, super exciting. The need for centralised resources, so an information hub, probably on Wine Australia's website, that we've started to pull together already, which is housing these practical tools and marketing collateral and information around ESG. And the last one there is ESG governance templates. This is a theme that came through really, really strongly. So small and medium grape and wine businesses in particular, really yelling out for some practical support around how they implement policies and procedures within their businesses that are going to be able to demonstrate that they've implemented best practice ESG and also fundamentally make their businesses more sustainable. So in this area, we're looking at designing a methodology through which you can assess the ESG risk of an Australian grape and wine business, and then fundamentally determine what needs to be implemented within that wine business to make sure that you've managed to, just getting some messages through there. Is there a technical issue, Prue, that I need to be aware of?
No, it's all good, Rachel. Please continue.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. So a methodology through which you can assess the ESG risk of an Australian grape and wine business, and then just determine what you need to implement within your business to sufficiently mitigate that risk. And then lastly, the ability to actually build templates that can be incorporated into your business that will be able to help you to firstly implement best practice ESG frameworks into your business, but also demonstrate that you have done so. So it really acknowledges that mum and dad grape grower up the road probably doesn't need to implement the same thing as Endeavour Drinks or Treasury Wine Estate. And similarly, if you're selling just from the cellar door, you probably don't need to implement the same sort of measures that you might if you're selling into one of the major retailers overseas. If you have 2 staff, you probably don't need to have the social policies in place that a larger company would do. So making sure that, that there is a proportionality. So what Australian grape and wine businesses are encouraged to do needs to be proportionate to what their ESG risk is. And an example of the type of templates that we'll look to build are akin to what the New Zealand government has built, and in fact business.gov has built recently, where you can actually go in and build your own contracts or your own templates. So a really good example of this is a tool that's available on business.gov's website, where you can go in and you can fill out a heap of information about your business, including the award that you sit under, and you can build your own employment contract. So which award do you sit under? What are the types of things that the employee is going to do? What is the employee's name? What are the terms of their employment? And that actually will spit out a employment contract. So being able to do that for all sorts of policies across Australian grape and wine businesses is where we would like to go with that, which is highly relevant across a whole lot of agricultural sectors. The second investment area is certification and market access, and this should come, as I said, as very little surprise, because ultimately our certification program becomes a ticket to play in a lot of these retail markets. Now it's on a really good path to doing that already, and already SWA certification, Sustainable Wine Growing Australia certification, is giving lots of exporters into a lot of the retailers and to a lot of markets globally, which is really, really pleasing to see. It is imperative that we continue to make sure that the modules that underpin Sustainable Wine Growing Australia are consistent with the metrics that are being demanded across the globe as far as E, S and G go. And I know Marty Longbottom and the team at AWRI are doing a really great job at looking at how we can particularly incorporate some of those social elements into that program. It is an area that is moving at pace. And whilst when you sort of say it quickly, it might sound really simple, this continuous improvement part is really important. So making sure we're staying abreast of exactly what is going on across the globe, which, as I mentioned, is difficult enough to stay abreast what's happening in 118 different markets. But when you're then looking at what individual retailers are actually imposing, it really is quite tricky. So there's a huge stakeholder exercise, mapping exercise to do there to make sure that we're continuously improving the modules that underpin SWA to ensure that that is continues to be a very useful tool in accessing a lot of these retailers. Very long term, we would love to look at the digital uplift of a Sustainable Wine Growing Australia to enhance interoperability and look at other data that could be exchanged through a similar program. A lot of you out there that already contribute data to all sorts of platforms will understand that there's a huge amount of duplication across the industry, and that is something that's on the agenda as well. On the SWA governance side, Sustainable Wine Growing Australia governance side, we'll continue to review what the governance arrangements ought to be as far as Sustainable Wine Growing Australia. I mentioned before the really great efforts across 3 organisations that are pulled together under a memorandum of understanding to run that program. As it evolves, we need to continue to look at those governance arrangements. Attraction and retention of Sustainable Wine Growing Australia members continues to be a real focus across the 3 organisations, and we really have seen groundswell in recent times across Sustainable Wine Growing Australia, which is really great to see. Sustainable Wine Growing Australia really is going to become the backbone of a lot of this. So making sure that that we're running that program in as an efficient and effective way as possible is super important. That includes looking at the future of Sustainable Wine Growing Australia auditors and whether that function could even be rolled in eventually to the label integrity program and offered as an extension of those audits. I feel really naive saying it now, looking back upon the development of this plan, but sustainable packaging or packaging itself was not an area that I anticipated having its own really niche spot. But the reality is that glass is on the nose across the globe. So glass is a product that takes an enormous amount of energy to produce. And it takes an enormous amount of energy to move it, not just by sea, but more importantly, actually across the ground. We're a huge country at risk of stating the bleeding obvious, and a huge percentage of our carbon emissions come from packaging. That's not to say that glass is going anywhere. Glass is a wonderful product for wine. It's inert, it's integral, and consumers love it. But we do need to look at ways in which we can make glass more sustainable. And already we're seeing demands out of the Nordic countries in particular for lightweight glass. So we need to look at that area. And I mentioned before the packaging directive that's being amended out of the European Union. Glass bottles will be up against it as far as void space goes. So again, at risk of stating the bleeding obvious, being circular or spherical, a wine bottle inherently has void spaces between it, so it's not like loading a sort of Tetra Paks into a truck. So again, that's going to be a challenge for glass. The industry has expressed a real desire to look at innovative packaging types, particularly for short shelf life products, and also for some of those innovative categories that are gaining momentum in mid-strength and in low and no alcohol. So there's a question for industry as to whether innovative packaging has a role to play in defining those categories themselves. Huge amount of work to do around life cycle assessments. There's already a lot of really good data out there. It's making that available. That's crucially important. And doing some work to match product types to packaging solutions. Super important that we're looking at the organoleptic impact of different packaging solutions on different types of products. And again, looking at the organoleptic impact of an innovative packaging solution on a short shelf life product that might be intended to be consumed in the first 2 weeks of purchase and kept in the fridge, as opposed to something that might be intended to be put down in the cellar or on the wine rack and kept for a much longer period of time. The other big area and risk in this area is around container deposit schemes. Many of you will have seen the announcement by the Queensland government that they will be, towards the end of this year, expanding the container deposit scheme in Queensland to wine bottles and spirit bottles. It is something that we're seeing across the globe, but the data to this at this point indicates that is not going to achieve the levels of recyclability that the industry is looking to reach, and that some of those international markets are going to be demanding in the current years. So a sector-wide environmental product stewardship program is an idea that's been floated by the sector. There is a lot of research to be done into what best practice product environmental stewardship around glass, wine glass in particular, would look. But whatever we do needs to be very focused on achieving the objectives of a scheme like a container deposit scheme, because at the moment that is unfortunately not the case. Moving along to investment area 4, innovation in ESG outcomes. So as I mentioned earlier, this is really running the ruler over the types of research and innovation investment that Wine Australia is already investing in, and making sure that they are aligned to the ESG investment plan. Now, there should be most things in here should come as no surprise, and I'll call out just a few of them. Evidence-based metrics. So crucially important that we have the scientific evidence to be able to sit behind any sort of environmental claims that we're making. And that's super important from the perspective of avoiding greenwashing that many of you will have heard about. Top priority from the ACCC, and the ACCC have a publicly state that their modus operandi is to make examples out of companies. So this is an area that they're looking at extremely closely, and they'll look to, for want of a better explanation, name and shame those that are doing the wrong things. It's also really important from a carbon inset perspective. So understanding what the opportunities for the sector are around carbon insets. And huge opportunity here to collaborate across other agricultural industries, but also potentially between other winemaking countries. Because if every industry, every agricultural industry and every winemaking industry comes up with their own evidence-based metrics and they're not the same, it is going to be an absolute mess. So that consistent measurement across the globe, validation and communication of ESG credentials is critically important, and having those evidence-based metrics to sit behind it also incredibly important. Grapevine breeding, huge role for grapevine breeding in this space, and we already have a very mature program in grapevine breeding, and particularly in looking at drought resistance and disease resistance. There have been varieties developed that are terrific around drought resistance and disease resistance, and also looking at evaluating existing varieties and clones and looking at their propensity to respond to drought conditions and high disease pressure vintages, which we've certainly seen in recent times, or certainly in 2022. The other one I'll call out there around grapevine breeding, and bear with me, this may sound a little bit tangential when I start talking about it, but the World Health Organization's policy position around alcohol has significantly changed in recent times. So it has moved from a policy position whereby the objective has been to decrease the harmful consumption of alcohol globally, to a policy position where they are looking at decreasing the consumption of alcohol globally, full stop. They have an objective of decreasing the overall global alcohol consumption by 20% by 2030, and all members of the World Health Organization are going to be required to submit data to support and to justify how they are trying to achieve that. So what that is going to do, and what it already has started to do, is to have a profound impact on the way in which alcohol is taxed globally. And we've seen a huge change in recent times in the UK. On the 1st of August this year, the UK implemented a new alcohol duty system that applies to wine. And without diving into the nitty-gritty detail of that, what it means is that wine above and below 11.5% ABV is being taxed at significantly different rates. So the original proposal was that at every 0.5 increment, ABV increment, a wine would be dutied at a different rate. Now, there are all sorts of issues around that, mostly from a logistical perspective, but also from a labelling perspective, and issues around different blends being slightly different ABVs, et cetera, et cetera. But we will see that in response to the World Health Organization's new policy position and their objectives to reduce that consumption by 20% by 2030, we will see this change in the way that alcohol is taxed, and moves by different jurisdictions to tax every gram of alcohol at the same rate, irrespective of which product it's in. And that's fundamentally what has happened in the UK. That incidentally, that arrangement will be in place in the UK to the 1st of February 2025. And it is likely that it will be extended beyond that, but there will be some further consultation there. So tangential, but my point is that it's more important than ever that we're looking at clones and varieties and viticultural practices that produce ripe fruit at low sugar levels. So here in Australia, many of you will know that typically we have to get to quite a high sugar level, quite a high BOME, before that maturity and ripeness is actually reached in grapes. So hugely important that we're looking at how we can get varieties and clones to ripen at lower sugar levels, therefore producing wines of lower alcohol that are taxed at a lower rate and attract a better margin. Sustainable usage of vineyard and winery inputs is critically important, looking at not necessarily limiting or eliminating things like herbicides, fungicides, insecticides and fertilizers, but more so looking at how we make sure that they're sustainable. So we're looking at alternatives to those things, not necessarily eliminating them, but how can we reduce the use of those things and make the use of them more sustainable. And in that category around sustainable usage of inputs, I also put water, also energy, and also processing aids in the actual winery. So looking at sustainable use of additives and processing aids, sanitizers, again, water, and looking at some of those processing aids that are on the nose. And one is PVPP, so being a plastic-based processing aid, one that is on the nose. Waste circularity, another really important one there around introduction of circularity asset management principles on a national and a regional scale, and not just looking at recyclability of glass and packaging here, but looking at on-farm waste, and particularly CCA posts, bird netting, irrigation, hosing, those sort of things. Adoption of climate adaptation and mitigation strategies. There's already some really great research that's been done in this space, but making sure that we're getting the grassroots uptake of some of these adaptation and mitigation strategies is of critical importance to make sure that we are well placed for climate resilience. And the carbon emission reductions roadmap that's been led by Sharon Harvey at Wine Australia is a really, really important step in that journey of the industry to practice best practice adoption of climate adaptation and mitigation strategies. The last investment area here, marketing and market insight. So first and foremost, critically important that we understand the customer sentiment as well as that consumer sentiment, and that we continue to understand what is the consumer's reaction towards certain innovative products. What do they think about sustainability? Can we educate them to understand what sustainability is? There's a huge amount of data that supports the notion that the consumer is very confused about what sustainable wine is at the moment, and that they really do bucket it in with organic wine, with biodynamic wine, with anything that's got a green claim attached to it, and also natural wine. So there's a huge consumer education piece to do in this area, and we really need to stay across what the sentiment is about these types of products, because the latest data to come out of Wine Intelligence in the UK actually, and glass half full here, I'm sorry, indicates that consumers are actually drawing analogies between sustainable wine and poor quality wine. So with the exception of China, which is a real outlier where they're really relating sustainability and drawing a relationship between sustainability and quality. In most markets, is actually the flip side. So the sustainable wines are actually considered to be of poorer quality than the unsustainable wines. So there's a huge consumer education piece to do that, and we need to make sure that we're not making assumptions around the demand that might be attached to a sustainable wine or a sustainable product. Similarly, crucially important that this becomes part of our brand strategy. So why do all this work? Why become best practice in this ESG space if we're not really shouting it to the rafters? And we've got some really great things as an industry in our back pocket, particularly in that social space. So as I mentioned before, a lot of legislative obligations that already apply to Australian grape and wine businesses that put them ahead of the game when you look at wine producing countries across the globe, who have really had to move quite fast to up the ante in their industries around industry codes of conduct and the like, to make sure that they're going over and above what the legislative requirements are in those industries. We are looking at the viability and the popularity of producing an ESG charter for the Australian grape and wine sector, and this is something that will be contemplated in the one sector plan, whether there is a propensity by industry to go down this path. If they were, it would be a charter that would make statements around targets and also commitments, whole of sector ESG ambitions and social areas, with a commitment to annually produce a sustainability report generated through the data that would be ideally collected through Sustainable Wine Growing Australia, so that we could actually track our performance against those targets and commitments set out in a charter. An industry that's already doing this really well in Australia is the cotton industry. If you get a chance, and if you're so inclined, have a look at their most recent sustainability report. And 100%, a lot of the larger companies are already doing this. So you will have seen just in the last few days, Treasury Wine Estates has put out their sustainability report. Endeavour Drinks have done something very similar. And it is, like I said, it's become a must do rather than a nice to do. So I apologise in advance if that made anyone feel a little bit sort of screen sick. There was a fair bit in that. I did promise that there were 7 slides. This is the 6th, and I, as promised, the last slide, which is the thank you slide. Thanks to Wine Communicators for having me, and thanks to everyone for their attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rachel. It is such a huge topic, isn't it? And rather complex. So I imagine that a lot of people in the audience are trying to digest everything that you've just shared with us. But can I remind everyone that now we're open for Q&A. So please feel free to type in any questions you may have for Rachel into that Q&A button just at the bottom of your screen there. And I'm also going to do a little plug of an upcoming Wine Communicators event whilst they're doing that next week in Sydney on Tuesday, the 17th of October. We've actually got a panel event being hosted at the Pernod Ricard wine offices about how can we sell Australian wine sustainability story. So I think that will be a really interesting conversation between producers and authorities as well. But question I have for you, Rachel, obviously you mentioned that the bigger companies are already getting on board, and obviously it's a huge investment of time and resource for them to do that. For the medium to small wine businesses that are on this call, what do you recommend is their first step into, learning more or just taking action in the ESG and sustainability space?
I think first and foremost, engagement with Sustainable Wine Growing Australia is critically important. So I think the sooner you can start on that sort of certification path, the better. And I think Sustainable Wine Growing Australia will be critically important in guiding small to medium businesses through what they need to do to implement best practice ESG, particularly as those metrics expand out to include, for example, those social elements. Yes. There will be some tools being developed that will help small to medium wine businesses implement best practice ESG across their businesses. But in the meantime, it is a matter of looking at where your risks potentially are. And by way of example, when you look at some of the sustainability reports and statements of some of the larger companies, a big risk area that they look at is in third-party contractors in vineyards. Okay, so where there is a vulnerable population that is being employed through a third party, and looking at the checks and balances that you might want to make sure that you employ within your business to make sure that those companies are actually demonstrating best practice workplace type arrangements, and because that is a huge social license issue, right? So even if you're going through a third party, if you've got workers that are being exposed to heat for long periods of time, or they're being underpaid, or they're not being offered sufficient accommodation, those are the types of sort of social risks that you need to really seek to mitigate. And every business is going to be different, right? But looking at those metrics that already sit behind Sustainable Wine Growing Australia, and making sure that you've got the house in order around the metrics that are already being captured is crucially important as a first step.
Fantastic. Thank you. Now, we have had a few questions flowing in. So first one is there a wine industry in another country or region that is doing this well at the moment, or are we all still at the same point? in the ESG
My,
journey?
yeah, so noting that every wine producing country has got different challenges. I really think that we're leading the charge in this space. But I do think we need to up the ante in the social space. So irrespective of the fact that yes, we're ahead of the curve in that we've got really great laws here in Australia about a lot of those things I've already mentioned. there are wine producing countries like South Africa who identified a very long time ago that they weren't going to cut the mustard on the social stuff unless they implemented codes of conduct specific to their industry. So they looked at minimum wages and education and training and diversity and inclusion and all those sort of things. But we need to be able to not sort of just accept that we've got those laws. We actually need to bring that to life. We need to tell the story, and we need to actually call out some of those specific risks within our sector. For example, heat stress of workers. Accommodation. We know that accommodation of transient workers in our country, in our rural areas, is really difficult. So we need to get ahead of the curve in some of those things. But I certainly don't think that we're falling behind. But if we don't continue on the trajectory that we currently are, we will. And the worst case scenario is that we lose market share as a result, and the best result is that we actually manage to gain market share through implementing really good practices.
Absolutely. Next question is, do you feel the wine industry are well placed to respond to ESG, or are there risks that need to be addressed before industry moves forward? I think you've most probably identified a few of those.
And I think I have identified some of those. I think we are well placed, because we have got this, pretty stringent laws in place already, but we need to do it in a way that's consistent. Okay. And that's where I think Wine Australia's got a leadership role to play here, to make sure that we are all singing from the same song sheet. Because if you're if you're a buyer at Systembolaget sitting up in Sweden and you're buying from so many different markets, you can't be expected to be across what the legislative obligations are in individual countries. So we need to make sure that we've got one story to tell as an industry that will become the ticket to play in a lot of those markets.
Yeah, absolutely. And next question, or firstly, a statement from Matthew. Yes, we certainly need to better educate consumers about sustainability, and we also need to better understand ways we can market and sell our wine. In this instance, will Wine Australia be considering moving some of the grape/wine research dollars outside of climate related adaptation and mitigation research to more marketing research, so we can sell our story and our wine better, as that appears to be a big challenge currently?
Yes, the answer, Matthew, is yes, and that really fits into that investment area 5. Already we are collecting data that we weren't sort of 6 months ago around sustainability in the market insights space. To better understand consumer sentiment towards sustainable wine, and what used to be the solar report that came out of the UK, out of Wine Intelligence, there, sustainable, organic, low, and other, an alternative, which is now coined the alternative wine sort of survey or index, does look at the opportunity index across a whole lot of different factors there. So that's really crucially important, and it looks across a lot of different markets as well. So that's where that information, there's really interesting data around consumer sentiment towards sustainability in China, in particular. We need to stay across that, and I think the second part that you're talking about is how do we incorporate this into our brand story, which is really important. And having walked around at Provine in Dusseldorf earlier in the year, I've got to say I was sort of expecting that we were going to be behind the curve here a bit. I was sort of expecting that a lot of wine producing countries were already going to have brand strategies that incorporated sustainability and green and all that sort of stuff, and they don't. I mean, even New Zealand hadn't incorporated that into their brand strategy. California are doing a lot more of it. but we certainly haven't missed the boat, and it does need to become part of our brand story.
Yeah, absolutely. And it looks like, credit to Wine Australia and all the other bodies involved. There's evidently been a huge amount of work and research done in this space, and now it's bringing that alive in I guess in wine businesses, in our storytelling across the board, to create a more sustainable future for the Australian wine industry. It's wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. I don't think we've got any more questions for today, but as Rachel said, head to Sustainability Wine Growing Australia. Have I got that right?
Sustainable Wine Growing Australia, yep.
Thank you. As your starting point to continue your own individual journey in this space. And I just want to highlight that our next WCA webinar and final one for the year will be held on Tuesday, the 14th of November, and it's been presented by the team at CCL Labels. So I imagine that they're going to touch on maybe some of that packaging side of sustainability in that presentation. We'll have everything live on our website over the next week, so keep an eye on that. And for all WCA members, recordings of past webinars are available to you to watch at any time. Just go onto our website on the Education tab and webinar recordings. And lastly, if you do have any suggestions for topics you'd like to be covered, I guess now in the 2024 program, please email me directly at wca@winecommunicators.com.au. Thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Rachel. For those with kids still on school holidays, have a great week, and we look forward to seeing you online soon.
Thanks, Prue. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.